It was a chilly Saturday afternoon when James Hudson decided to take a trip to the local mall. The sun barely pierced through the heavy clouds, leaving the streets a muted gray. Despite the dreary weather, the mall was bustling with activity. Shoppers weaved in and out of stores, families with children laughing and chatting, and teenagers loitered near the food court. James, a man in his mid-30s, walked confidently through the entrance, his boots echoing on the polished marble floor. James wasn't a typical mall-goer. He was a simple man with a strong sense of individuality. His attire, a faded denim jacket paired with dark jeans, was nothing out of the ordinary. But the piece that set him apart was the red MAGA cap perched on his head, a statement he wore proudly. It wasn't just a hat for James. It was a symbol of his beliefs, a statement about the political climate that had consumed the country. He wasn't here to make trouble, just to do some shopping and maybe grab a coffee. But as he passed through the sliding glass doors, he felt the weight of the glares from the people around him. Some gave him quick, dismissive looks. Others stared openly, whispering to each other. A few, perhaps feeling bold, shot him a disapproving glance, but he wasn't fazed. James had been wearing this cap for years, ever since he felt the need to publicly voice his stance on the direction of the country. It didn't matter if people agreed or disagreed. He wore it because he could. The mall was no different than any other place. He was here to live his life as he saw fit. Walking into the first store, a high-end clothing shop that he only visited for the occasional sale, he made his way to the clearance rack. He grabbed a couple of shirts to try on and headed for the fitting rooms. As he stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the cap, he noticed a group of women near the entrance of the store exchanging glances. One of them, an older woman with sharp eyes, gave him a stern look before muttering something to her friend. James ignored them. He wasn't here for approval. A few minutes later, as he was deciding on which shirt to pick, he heard footsteps approaching. A security guard, young and well-groomed, stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "Excuse me, sir," the guard said, his tone polite but firm. "Could you step out here for a moment?" James turned, slightly confused. "What's the problem?" he asked, lifting an eyebrow. The guard didn't seem aggressive, but the situation was starting to feel a bit off. The security guard motioned for him to step outside the store, and James, not wanting to escalate things yet, complied. James followed the security guard to the middle of the mall, his boots clicking against the marble floor. The guard's movements were deliberate, and his expression was neutral, but there was an undeniable tension in the air. The hustle of shoppers around them seemed to fade away, and for a moment it felt like the world had quieted to a standstill. When they stopped in front of a set of mall benches, the guard crossed his arms and spoke in a measured tone. "I'm going to have to ask you to take that hat off, sir," the guard said, glancing at James' MAGA cap. "It's causing some complaints from other shoppers, and we have a dress code here." James blinked, stunned for a second. He looked at the guard, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. This wasn't the first time he had worn the hat out in public. He had worn it to protests, rallies, even out to bars with friends. Never once had someone dared to challenge him directly about it. "You're telling me that this hat is causing problems?" James asked, his voice rising slightly. "It's just a hat. It's my right to wear it, isn't it?" The guard glanced over his shoulder, his eyes shifting nervously as he checked for any other mall staff nearby. There were a few people sitting on the benches, looking on with interest, but none seemed ready to intervene. "Look, sir," the guard continued, his voice softening but still firm. "We've had some complaints. People have expressed discomfort, and it's part of the mall's policy to maintain a certain environment. If you just take it off for the rest of your visit, everything can go smoothly." James' eyes narrowed as he processed the request. His hands instinctively clenched at his sides. He wasn't about to let someone dictate what he could or couldn't wear, especially in a public space. He had faced criticism for his cap before. Heck, he'd even had arguments with people on social media about it. But this was different. This was a violation of his personal rights, and he wasn't going to let it slide. "Are you serious?" he asked, his tone edging toward disbelief. "You want me to take it off just because someone else is offended? This is America, right? I have the right to wear what I want." The guard shifted his stance, clearly uncomfortable. He glanced around, as if hoping for backup from a higher authority. "I'm just doing my job, sir," the guard replied. "It's not personal. If you don't want to take it off voluntarily, I'll have to escort you out." James couldn't believe what he was hearing. His frustration started to bubble up, but he forced himself to take a deep breath. The last thing he wanted was to escalate the situation further. But then he thought about the principle behind it. The idea that, in America, a man should be free to express his beliefs, no matter how unpopular or controversial they might be. He wasn't going to back down. "I'm not taking it off," James said firmly, meeting the guard's gaze head-on. "And I'm not leaving. I've done nothing wrong." The guard's face tightened, and he straightened up, clearly preparing for the worst. "You're going to have to leave the premises, sir," he repeated, his voice losing some of its politeness. James looked around. The people nearby were beginning to take notice of the exchange. Some of them watched in silence, while others murmured to each other. A couple of teenage girls in the corner exchanged whispers, their eyes glancing over at him nervously. One woman, walking with a stroller, slowed down and shot him a look of disapproval before turning her head away. "I'm not going anywhere," James repeated, his voice unwavering. "If you want me to leave, you're going to have to force me." For a moment, the mall seemed to freeze. The tension between James and the guard was palpable. The hustle of shoppers around them continued, but James felt like he was in the middle of a storm that nobody else could see. The decision he had just made to stand his ground now felt like the first of many. The guard looked behind him and then nodded slowly. All right, sir. I'll call for backup. Don't make this any harder than it has to be." James stood his ground, refusing to be intimidated. But in the pit of his stomach, a sense of unease began to stir. This wasn't just a simple disagreement anymore. It was becoming something bigger. Something that would either force him to back down or make a stand for his rights. He wasn't sure how far things would go, but he was ready to fight for his freedom, no matter the cost. James stood firm as the security guard turned away to make a call, his phone already pressed to his ear. The words "backup" floated into the air, and James could feel the weight of them. He wasn't worried about the police showing up just yet. He wasn't doing anything illegal. The mall had no real right to demand he take off his hat. Still, a part of him couldn't help but feel the tide shifting. What had started as a simple interaction was turning into something that might define the rest of his day, maybe even the rest of his life. The mall's atmosphere, which had felt so ordinary just moments before, was now thick with tension. He could see people turning their heads, some glancing over with concern, others blatantly staring. A few of the shoppers seemed uncomfortable, either unsure of what to do or hoping the situation would resolve itself quickly. But James could sense that many of them weren't on his side. He didn't care, though. He wasn't here to make friends. The Miles Pass system crackled, and an announcement echoed throughout the halls, though it had nothing to do with his situation. But the underlying sense of authority in that voice made James feel like a target. A few seconds later, 2 more security guards arrived at the scene. They were tall, broad-shouldered, and wore stern expressions, but neither made any move toward him immediately. Instead, they stood by the first guard, whispering amongst themselves. "Is this really necessary?" James asked, trying to stay calm, but his frustration was creeping into his voice. "I'm just wearing a hat. Are you seriously going to make a scene out of this?" One of the new guards, a woman with short, cropped hair, glanced at him coolly. "It's not about the hat," she said, her tone clipped. "It's about the disruptions you're causing?" "Disruptions?" James scoffed. "Is that what this is about? Some people are uncomfortable? Well, I'm uncomfortable with people telling me what I can and can't wear in public." "Sir," the first guard, who had originally asked him to remove the hat, spoke up again. "We're just asking you to comply. If you don't, we'll have to escort you out of the mall. If you continue to cause a scene, we'll call the police." At that, James' patience was running thin. He had been calm, reasonable, even polite at the start, but now, the principle of the matter was taking over. This wasn't just about wearing a hat. It was about standing up to what felt like oppression, about not letting someone dictate his freedom. This wasn't just an isolated incident anymore. It was a test of his resolve. "I'm not going anywhere," James said firmly, his voice carrying more weight now. You can call the cops if you want. But I'm not leaving until I've finished my shopping, and I'm not taking off my hat." The woman guard's lips tightened into a thin line. She stepped forward and raised an eyebrow, as if she were measuring him up. "You're making a choice to make this difficult. We don't want to make it harder on you, but you're forcing our hand." For a brief moment, the crowd around them grew even quieter. A few people were staring openly now. Some filming on their phones, no doubt planning to post the encounter on social media. James felt the eyes of everyone around him, the weight of judgment from strangers, and yet he felt more resolved than ever. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about showing that you didn't have to bow down to authority when you knew you were right. This was bigger than a shopping trip. The guards exchanged glances, and that's when James noticed a man in a suit walking toward them. He was tall, with a professional air, likely someone from mall management. His face was serious, but not necessarily hostile. He didn't appear angry, but James could tell he wasn't here to have a pleasant chat either. The manager, who introduced himself as Mr. Caldwell, extended a hand toward James, his expression stern but composed. "Sir," Mr. Caldwell began, "I'm the manager of this mall. We've had several complaints about your hat. We're just trying to maintain a peaceful shopping environment here. I'd appreciate it if you would cooperate." James looked at the manager's outstretched hand but didn't take it. He wasn't here to shake hands, not when his rights were being trampled on. He crossed his arms in front of his chest, mirroring the posture of the guards. "I'm not going to cooperate with this," James said evenly. "What's next? Am I going to get arrested for wearing a hat?" "Not yet," Mr. Caldwell replied, his voice maintaining a calm but firm tone. "But if you don't comply with our request, we will have no choice but to ask the police to intervene." "Intervene for what? Wearing a hat?" James shook his head, his disbelief growing. He couldn't fathom the absurdity of the situation. "I'm a paying customer here. I've done nothing wrong. I have the right to express myself however I see fit." The manager paused, his gaze flicking to the crowd that had gathered. The people watching, some with phones out, others whispering among themselves, were making it clear that they were paying attention. James knew this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about a larger cultural divide, and they were all witnessing it. Mr. Caldwell stepped back slightly, his expression unreadable, as though weighing his next move. "Look, I don't want to escalate this further," he said after a beat. "I'm asking you one last time to take off the hat or leave the premises voluntarily. If you refuse, we will have to take more drastic measures." James felt the pressure building. The more they demanded, the more stubborn he became. This wasn't a fight he had asked for, but it was one he wasn't going to back down from. "I'm not going anywhere," James repeated, his voice steady but resolute. "I'm not taking off my hat, and I'm not leaving." Mr. Caldwell took a deep breath and glanced at the guards. The woman nodded, signaling to the others. It was clear that the situation was on the verge of spiraling into something far bigger. The silence in the mall grew heavier as the tension mounted. James could feel his heart pounding, but he refused to back down. He stood his ground, not just for himself but for the principle that this wasn't just about a hat. It was about the larger picture, about a society that was quick to judge, quick to try and silence those who didn't conform to the dominant narrative. As Mr. Caldwell stepped back, James watched his every move, preparing himself for what was next. The moment felt like an eternity, the stares of onlookers burning into his skin, their phones capturing everything. A few people had gathered in small clusters around him, talking in hushed tones. Some seemed sympathetic, others not so much. Mr. Caldwell finally spoke again, his voice low but firm. "You leave me no choice, sir. I've already asked you twice to comply. This is your last chance." "I'm not going to comply," James replied, his voice unwavering. "I'm just wearing a hat." "There's no reason for you to do this." The manager exchanged a look with the guards and sighed, clearly frustrated. "I don't want this to escalate," he said, almost pleading, though there was a distinct air of finality in his voice. "But we're calling the police. If you don't leave now, you'll be forcibly removed." James didn't flinch. His mind was clear, and he knew what was at stake. He was determined to see this through. If they wanted to call the police, so be it. At least then, maybe others would see the absurdity of the situation. Maybe the world would wake up to the fact that freedom of expression was being stifled in the most unexpected of places. The security guards stepped forward, blocking his path, their posture rigid and authoritative. One of them, the woman who had been the most vocal earlier, now spoke with a tone of finality. "We're giving you one last chance. Leave now or we'll have no choice but to call the authorities." James took a step back and glanced around, meeting the eyes of the people in the crowd. A few of them nodded slightly, as if they were silently offering their support. He wondered how many of them would have spoken up if they hadn't been afraid of causing trouble. He could almost feel the collective unease in the air, but in that moment, as he stood there with his back straight and his chin lifted, he didn't feel alone. Even if he wasn't backing down. Mr. Caldwell's expression tightened. He raised his hand, signaling one of the guards. The guard quickly pulled out a walkie-talkie and spoke briefly into it, confirming that the police had been contacted. The other shoppers had begun to disperse, some leaving, others turning away. The excitement of the drama had worn off for many, but the ones who stayed behind continued to watch, waiting to see how the situation would resolve. James felt the cold air of the mall's AC on his skin, unmoving. This was his stand, his moment. And he would not be swayed. The police were on their way now. They would be here soon, but James wasn't sure whether they would see his side or not. After all, the mall was a private property, and they had every right to enforce their policies, right? But that didn't make it right. The seconds seemed to stretch into minutes as he waited. Then, from behind him, he heard the sound of footsteps. Firm, rapid, and purposeful. He turned slightly and saw two officers approaching. They wore standard police uniforms, and their expressions were focused, professional, as they scanned the scene. Their eyes moved over James, then to the security guards and Mr. Caldwell. One of the officers, a man in his mid-40s with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped forward. He sized up the situation quickly, his gaze briefly flicking to James' MAGA hat before he turned to Mr. Caldwell. "Sir?" the officer began, his voice authoritative but not unfriendly. "What seems to be the problem here?" Mr. Caldwell quickly explained the situation. He pointed toward James and recounted the earlier interactions. "This gentleman refuses to remove his hat, despite repeated requests. We've asked him to leave, but he's being disruptive." The officer nodded, his expression impassive. He turned to James next. "Sir, can you step over here for a moment?" James hesitated for a second but walked over to the officer. The guards kept a close eye on him, standing at the ready. The second officer, a younger woman with a stern face, kept her distance but remained vigilant. "Do you understand why you've been asked to leave the premises?" the officer asked, his tone even but firm. "I do," James replied, his voice clear. "But I am not leaving. I am wearing a hat. That's it. I'm not causing trouble. I'm just here to shop." The officer nodded, clearly processing his words. "I understand, but the mall has the right to set their own rules. You're on private property. If they've asked you to leave, you are required to comply." "I'm not causing a scene," James protested. "I'm not doing anything illegal." "Understood," the officer said, his voice softening slightly. "But I have to ask you to leave, sir. We don't want this to escalate further." James felt his anger rise again, but he kept it in check. "I'm not going anywhere." The officer glanced at the security guards and Mr. Caldwell. Then, without saying another word, he pulled out his radio and spoke briefly into it. James could feel the weight of the moment. He didn't know if the police would be on his side, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about standing up for something larger. He wasn't going to let them intimidate him into silence. The officer finished his radio call, and a short moment later, another squad car arrived at the mall entrance. Two more officers stepped out, their faces serious. The situation had gone from a minor dispute to a full-on standoff. It was clear that things were about to escalate even further. James could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on him, the pressure mounting. The two new officers, both younger than the first, seemed more inclined to defuse the situation. One, a woman with short black hair, quickly scanned the crowd, noticing the tension in the air. The other officer, a tall man in his mid-30s, made eye contact with James and took a step closer. "All right, sir," the man said, his voice low but firm. "We're going to need you to come with us. You've been asked to leave, and we can't allow you to stay." James clenched his fists, the sting of the injustice hitting him like a tidal wave. He had done nothing wrong, and yet here he was, surrounded by law enforcement, being asked to leave the public space. He could feel the eyes of the onlookers, some of them beginning to murmur quietly, others openly filming the interaction. "This is ridiculous," James said, shaking his head. "I'm not breaking any laws. I'm just wearing a hat. You can't arrest me for this." The woman officer stepped forward, her hand raised in a gesture to calm the situation. "We're not arresting you, sir. We're simply asking you to leave. If you refuse, we'll have no choice but to escort you out." James took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "I'm not leaving," he repeated. "This isn't about a hat. It's about my rights. You can't force me to leave just because of what I'm wearing." The second officer, the tall man, looked over at his partner and then back at James. "You're making this difficult for everyone involved, sir. We're asking you to leave voluntarily. If not, we'll have to take further action." James could feel the tension in his chest, but he stood his ground. He wasn't going to back down, not now. Not after everything that had led to this point. "I'm not leaving," he said once again, his voice calm but firm. One of the security guards, the woman who had been particularly insistent earlier, stepped forward, her patience clearly wearing thin. "We gave you plenty of chances to leave quietly," she said, her voice sharp. "You didn't want to listen. Now you're making it harder for yourself. Just leave. It's not worth it." But James refused to be intimidated. The world was watching. At least, it felt like the world was watching. This was about more than just him. It was about standing up for freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and against the kind of censorship that had started to permeate even the most ordinary aspects of life. "Do what you have to do," James said, his voice steady. "But I'm not going anywhere." The officers exchanged a brief glance. They were trained for situations like this, but this wasn't a standard confrontation. There were no weapons involved, no violence, just a disagreement over something as simple as a hat. And yet, the way it had spiraled out of control felt overwhelming. One of the officers, the woman with short black hair, finally sighed. "All right, sir. If you're not going to leave voluntarily, then we'll have to arrest you for trespassing. You're refusing to comply with a lawful request to leave." James' stomach sank as the words hit him like a punch. "Arrested?" he repeated, disbelief creeping into his voice. "You're really going to arrest me over a hat?" But the officer's expression remained unchanged. "If you're not willing to leave, sir, you're making it an arrestable offense. You've been told multiple times." Before James could respond, the officers moved in, their hands going toward his arms. James instinctively stepped back, shaking his head. "This is insane," he muttered, his voice tinged with frustration. "You're arresting me for something so stupid." The crowd around them had grown in size, people clearly more interested in the spectacle than the actual issue at hand. Phones were held high, capturing every moment of the tense standoff. There were whispers, some supportive, some critical. A couple of people stepped forward, clearly ready to speak out in his defense, but most stayed in the background, unsure of what was going to happen next. James stood frozen for a moment as the officers approached, trying to make sense of what was happening. He had never imagined his day would go like this. He had simply come to the mall, hoping to get a few items and enjoy a normal Saturday. But here he was, facing the very real possibility of being carted off in handcuffs. The officer grabbed James' arm firmly, pulling him toward the exit. "Come with us, sir," he said once again, this time with a tone that left no room for argument. "I'm not resisting," James said, his voice resigned but defiant. "I'm not going anywhere without a fight." "You're making a mistake." Despite his words, The officer's grip tightened, and they led James toward the doors. The crowd parted to make way for them, and James could hear the hum of conversation in the background, voices mixing with the sound of his boots hitting the polished floor. As they neared the mall exit, James glanced back. He saw Mr. Caldwell standing near the entrance, a look of satisfaction on his face. The guards were still close, keeping their eyes on him as he was escorted through the mall, and the officers seemed determined to ensure the situation didn't escalate further. It was a strange feeling, being escorted out like a criminal when all he had done was wear a piece of clothing that expressed his beliefs. The world felt like it was closing in on him, the walls of the mall seemingly more confining than ever before. The sound of the heavy mall doors closing behind James felt like a final punctuation mark on the events of the day. He was outside now, standing on the pavement, surrounded by the cold, sterile atmosphere of the parking lot. The officers had loosened their grip on him, but their presence was still felt, like a shadow hanging over him, ready to escalate if needed. James took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. He could feel the heat rising to his face, his blood boiling with frustration, but he was determined not to let it show. He had made it this far, but now what? Would his day end here, or would there be more to come? As the officers stood a few feet away, talking in hushed tones, James looked around. A couple of mall-goers had followed him outside, keeping their distance but clearly watching the scene unfold. Some looked at him with pity, others with curiosity, and a few, much to his dismay, seemed to look on with disdain. It was as though they were waiting for him to crack, for him to do something that would justify their judgment. But James wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. He had been wronged, and he would make sure the world knew about it. One of the officers, the woman with short black hair, turned back toward him. Her expression was softening a little, but there was still an air of professionalism about her. "You're free to go now," she said. "But we'll need to report this to mall security. You're not allowed to return today." James didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced down at his phone, which had been vibrating in his pocket for the past few minutes. It was his sister calling again. He had ignored it several times already, not wanting to explain what was happening. But now, it felt unavoidable. He pulled the phone out, his fingers trembling slightly as he swiped to answer. "James?" His sister's voice crackled through the speaker. "What happened? I saw the videos. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," James replied, his voice tight. He took a step away from the officers, wanting some privacy for this conversation. "I got kicked out of the mall for wearing a MAGA hat. Can you believe that? Are you serious? Oh my God, that's insane. Did they arrest you?" She sounded both concerned and bewildered, and James could hear her moving around, probably pacing. "No," he said, his voice rising with the frustration he had been trying to contain. "They didn't arrest me, but they tried to. They threatened to charge me with trespassing. I'm sorry, James. That's messed up. What are you going to do?" she asked, her tone serious now. "I don't know," he muttered. "It's not just about the hat. It's about the principle of it all. I'm not going to let this slide. I'm going to make sure people know what happened. This shouldn't be happening in America." "I get it," she said, her voice softening. "Just be careful, okay? People are already talking about it. I saw the video going viral online." The mention of the viral video hit James like a punch to the gut. He hadn't been paying attention to the social media storm that had been brewing around him. But now, as his phone buzzed again with multiple notifications, he realized the extent of what was happening. "I need to go," he said quickly. "I'll call you later." Before she could respond, James ended the call and glanced down at the phone again. The screen was filled with messages, texts from friends, family, and even strangers. There were links to Twitter threads, Facebook posts, and Instagram stories. All of them were talking about the incident. Some were outraged, others were mocking him, and a few seemed genuinely sympathetic. But, in the flood of opinions, one thing was clear. This was no longer just about him. It was a debate, a conversation that was now unfolding across the internet. People were picking sides, making assumptions, and arguing over the right to wear a political hat in public. It had become a symbol, not just of James' personal beliefs, but of something larger, a battle over freedom of expression, political polarization, and the growing divide between different factions of society. As the minutes ticked by, James's mind raced. He had to take action. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a much bigger pattern. He knew that this wouldn't be the last time something like this happened, and he wasn't about to let it go quietly into the night. He glanced at the officers once more. They were still talking amongst themselves, unaware of the storm that was building around them. James took a final breath, steeling himself for what came next. He wasn't just going to walk away from this. He was going to make his voice heard. His first step was easy. He pulled his phone out and started typing, drafting a post. He needed to get his side of the story out before anyone else could twist it. As he typed, he could hear the words forming in his mind, the frustration giving way to clarity. I was just kicked out of the mall for wearing a MAGA hat. They told me it was offensive and tried to arrest me for trespassing. This is the reality of living in a country where free speech is under attack. If you can't wear what you want without fear of being harassed or kicked out, then we have a problem. Share this, because it's happening everywhere. James hit send and then stared at the post for a moment, watching the reactions flood in. Some were supportive, others critical. But as the minutes passed, more and more people began to take notice. The next few days felt like a blur for James. What had started as a personal inconvenience quickly exploded into a full-blown media storm. His post, shared across multiple social platforms, had gone viral. People were debating, sharing their opinions, and making judgments, some of them more vicious than others. It was no longer just about the mall or the MAGA hat. It had become a national issue. James woke up on the third day since the incident to a flood of notifications. His phone was almost too hot to touch, buzzing with texts, emails, and notifications from social media. The video of him being escorted out by the officers was circulating like wildfire. It had already garnered millions of views, and news outlets were picking up on it. He scrolled through his social media, unable to keep up with the barrage of messages. His phone rang again. This time, it was from a reporter at a major news outlet. "Hi, is this James Thompson?" the voice asked. "Yeah, this is him," James replied, trying to hide the weariness in his voice. "I'm Jessica Miller from the Daily Times. I wanted to ask you a few questions about the incident at the mall. We've seen the video, and we're getting a lot of inquiries. Would you be willing to do an interview?" James paused for a moment. His gut instinct told him to say no, to just lay low and ride out the storm. But a part of him, maybe it was the same part that had led him to post that message in the first place, felt like he couldn't back down now. "I'll do the interview," James said, his voice steady despite the anxiety bubbling inside him. "Great. We'll send someone over to your place. Is that okay?" "Yeah, that works," James agreed, and with that, the call ended. As he sat down on the couch, still trying to process everything, the weight of the situation hit him like a ton of bricks. His decision to post the video and the message had thrust him into a larger conversation. It wasn't just his battle anymore. It was a cultural battle. The issue of free speech, political expression, and cancel culture had all been thrust into the spotlight, and James was right at the center of it. But as much as he understood the significance of it all, he couldn't escape the overwhelming feeling of being trapped in a storm. He hadn't signed up for this level of scrutiny. All he had wanted to do was wear a hat in peace, not become a political pawn in an ideological war. The next hour passed in a haze as he tried to prepare himself for the interview. His mind kept racing back to the mall and the officers' faces as they escorted him out. It felt like a lifetime ago, but at the same time, it was still so fresh in his mind. His anger hadn't dulled. If anything, it had intensified. When the reporter arrived, a woman in her late 30s with short blonde hair and a no-nonsense attitude, James led her to his living room. She set up her camera equipment, adjusting the lighting and checking her gear as he sat down. She looked at him and smiled faintly. "Ready when you are," she said, her tone professional but not unfriendly. James took a deep breath. This wasn't going to be easy, but he had made his decision, and he was going to stick with. The interview began with some general questions about his background and his life leading up to the mall incident. James gave short, concise answers, trying to keep his emotions in check. But as soon as the conversation turned to the hat and the events at the mall, his frustration bubbled to the surface. "Let's talk about what happened at the mall," Jessica said, glancing at her notes. "Can you walk us through what led up to you being kicked out?" James didn't hesitate. He leaned forward, his voice firm but controlled. "Look, I was just minding my business, shopping, trying to get some things done. I'm wearing my MAGA hat, something I've worn plenty of times before. It's just a hat. But apparently, that's a problem now," he said, his tone rising slightly. "A security guard came up to me, and right off the bat, he told me it was offensive. I was confused, but I kept calm. I tried to explain, but then it just escalated. They told me I had to leave or they'd call the cops. And when I refused, they actually called the police. I wasn't doing anything wrong, but they treated me like a criminal." Jessica listened intently, occasionally nodding. "And how did the police respond when they arrived?" They were fine," James said, his jaw tightening. "They didn't arrest me or anything, but they made it clear that I couldn't stay. They said I was trespassing and that I had to leave immediately. It wasn't even about what I was doing. It was about what I was wearing, a piece of clothing that apparently people can't handle anymore." The camera continued to roll, capturing every word. James was fired up now, his earlier nerves replaced by a clear sense of purpose. He knew that what had happened to him wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a growing trend of people being silenced, shut down, or even punished for their beliefs. And he was going to make sure that everyone knew about it. The interview continued for another 20 minutes, covering everything from his thoughts on cancel culture to his views on free speech. By the end, James felt a little lighter, as if he had finally gotten everything off his chest. As the camera crew packed up, Jessica turned to him with a smile. "Thanks for your time, James. We'll let you know when the story airs." James nodded, his mind still racing, but he had taken his first step into the larger public conversation, and now there was no turning back. As the days passed, the media storm surrounding James only intensified. The video of his confrontation at the mall, shared millions of times across social media, became a symbol of a much larger cultural conflict. People from all sides of the political spectrum weighed in, making it clear that this wasn't just about a hat. It was about free speech, political expression, and the increasing polarization of the nation. News outlets covered the story from every angle. The incident sparked heated debates on talk shows and podcasts. Comment sections were flooded with strong opinions, and hashtags like #MAGAHotgate and #cancelculture became trending topics. But amid the noise, a very clear divide emerged. Those who supported James and his right to wear whatever he wanted, and those who saw the MAGA hat as a symbol of intolerance, division, and hate. James found himself at the center of it all, thrust into a cultural war he hadn't signed up for. His inbox was filled with messages, some supportive, some hostile. Friends and family reached out to him, some voicing their concerns, others applauding his stand. But what struck him most were the strangers, people who had no personal connection to him, but felt deeply compelled to share their views, whether positive or negative. Some of the messages were outright angry. "Are you really that deluded? Wearing that hat just makes you a part of the problem. You should be ashamed of yourself," one message read. Others were more supportive, thanking him for standing up for what they believed in. "Thanks for speaking out. It's time people stop getting punished for expressing their beliefs. Keep your head up," another message said. The sheer volume of messages was overwhelming. It felt as though his every move was being scrutinized, his every word analyzed. The weight of it all was exhausting. James spent hours on social media, engaging with both supporters and critics. He would respond to some messages, arguing his point, trying to explain himself. But for every civil conversation, there were 5 more that devolved into shouting matches. The more he engaged, the more it felt like he was sinking into an endless cycle of online conflict. It was draining, and yet he couldn't stop. Meanwhile, The mall where the incident had occurred was feeling the pressure. There were protests outside the mall by supporters of James, holding signs that read, "Free speech, not censorship, and stop the cancel culture." The mall's management, clearly caught in the crossfire, issued a statement saying they were reviewing the incident internally. But that didn't stop the growing outrage. A group of local activists organized a protest to demand that the mall apologize and reinstate James' right to shop freely. They even launched a petition which gained traction online, calling for an end to discrimination against political expression. The petition garnered thousands of signatures in just a few days, with people rallying behind James, believing that his treatment was a clear violation of his rights. But there were also counter-protests. Activists against what they saw as the normalization of hate speech rallied in front of the mall, calling for consequences for those who perpetuated harmful ideologies. They chanted slogans about equality, justice, and the need for a society that would not tolerate hate in any form. James was now the face of something much bigger than a single incident at a shopping center. He had become a symbol whether he liked it or not. He was caught between two sides that had become increasingly entrenched in their views, neither willing to budge, neither willing to listen. To make matters worse, the mall's management was coming under increasing scrutiny from both sides. While some were calling for an apology and a reversal of their decision, others were calling for a boycott of the mall. James began to receive offers from various media outlets, inviting him to speak on the issue. They wanted to know his thoughts on freedom of speech, political correctness, and the growing divide in the country. Despite his internal hesitation, James felt the pressure to speak out. He knew that his voice, no matter how small, could add fuel to the conversation. But at the same time, he couldn't help but feel like he was being used, like he was just another pawn in a game much bigger than him. It was around this time that James' family started to get worried. His mother called him one afternoon, her voice trembling with concern. "James, I'm worried about you. This whole thing is getting out of control. Maybe it's time to step back from all of this," she said. "It's not worth it. You're not just fighting for your rights anymore. You're fighting with strangers, with people you don't even know. It's getting dangerous." James had heard similar sentiments from his father and friends. They were all worried about his well-being. But for James, it felt like quitting was not an option. He had opened a door, and now he couldn't close it. He was already too deep into the fight. The thing was, James didn't consider himself a political person. He had never been outspoken about his beliefs before this incident. He was just a regular guy who had worn a hat, and now his life was consumed by the very thing he had tried to avoid: politics. He wasn't trying to make a statement, but that's exactly what he had done. James found himself torn between wanting to retreat from the spotlight and feeling a responsibility to continue fighting. He knew that the situation wasn't just about him anymore. It was about a larger issue of political expression and personal freedom. The pressure was mounting, and he knew that there was no easy way out. The pressure was relentless, but James was no longer the naive man who had innocently walked into the mall with his MAGA hat. He had become a figure of controversy, a lightning rod for every political and cultural debate raging across the nation. It was a strange feeling, at once exhilarating and suffocating. The messages, the debates, the protests, they were all a constant reminder that he had crossed into uncharted territory, and there was no going back. The days that followed were filled with back-and-forth media appearances. James found himself on both local news broadcasts and national talk shows, discussing everything from his right to wear the hat to the broader implications of free speech. Every time he spoke, he was careful with his words, trying to avoid further inflaming the situation. But no matter how he framed it, the people who disagreed with him only grew more vocal. "You're just part of the problem," one caller shouted during a live radio interview. "You're wearing a symbol of hate and division. Don't you see that?" James had braced himself for that kind of response. It was inevitable, but it still stung. He'd never been a confrontational person. He preferred quiet, civil conversations, but now he was forced into a public arena where every word mattered. The pressure began to wear on him, and his resolve started to weaken. At times he wondered if it was worth it. But there were also those who supported him, who felt his pain and frustration. Supporters called into the same radio station to speak out in his defense. They argued that James had every right to wear the hat, that cancel culture was choking the life out of free speech in America. One caller even shared a personal story about how they had been similarly discriminated against for their political views. "I've been kicked out of places for wearing my MAGA hat too," one man said. "I understand what James is going through. This isn't about politics anymore. It's about being able to express yourself without fear of backlash." The public discourse surrounding the incident reached a boiling point when the mall management, under increasing pressure, released a statement addressing the controversy. They had spent days hiding behind vague responses, but now they finally spoke up. Their statement was a careful attempt to walk the line, acknowledging the right to free speech, while also condemning any actions or symbols associated with hate. "The mall is a place for everyone," the statement read. "We strive to maintain a welcoming environment for all our patrons. We regret any actions that may have made individuals feel uncomfortable or unwelcome. We are reviewing our policies and will work to ensure that everyone feels safe when shopping here." To James, the statement felt hollow. It was a vague attempt at appeasement, and it didn't address the core issue: his right to wear a hat that represented his political views. He wasn't expecting an apology, but he had hoped for something more substantive. The mall's refusal to take a stronger stance only fueled his determination to press on. In the days that followed, James started receiving media offers that were more than just interviews. Some outlets, especially those aligned with conservative voices, invited him to participate in public debates, town halls, and even rallies. Some of the more extreme platforms began to champion him as a symbol of the fight against cancel culture, offering him opportunities to become a public spokesperson for freedom of expression. The attention, while flattering, only further complicated James' emotions. Was he being used? Would he become just another pawn in a larger ideological war? Despite his doubts, James realized that he had become part of something much bigger. Whether he liked it or not, he was now in the fight for the soul of the nation. A battle between free speech and the growing call for political correctness. There was no going back. At the same time, James began to notice something else: how quickly people were willing to label him. To his supporters, he was a hero, a defender of free speech. To his detractors, he was a villain, a symbol of everything wrong with America's political landscape. But to James, he was still just a man who had walked into a mall and been kicked out for wearing a hat, and now he was caught in a storm he hadn't created, but couldn't escape. One evening, as he sat on his couch, scrolling through the latest headlines, he felt a sense of unease settle over him. It was like a weight had been placed on his chest, and he couldn't breathe. The constant barrage of opinions, the endless debates, the constant media attention, it was starting to take its toll. He could feel his sense of self slipping away, replaced by the person the media wanted him to be. The pressure mounted with every passing day, and it soon became clear that he had to make a decision. Would he continue to fight, embracing the role he had been thrust into? Or would he step back and try to reclaim some semblance of normalcy? Then, the tipping point came. A protest, organized by those who had supported James throughout the controversy, was scheduled to take place outside the mall. The event had the potential to turn ugly, and James could already feel the tension in the air. Some of the more extreme factions within the protest began to incite violence, calling for clashes with counter-protesters. News outlets were preparing for a spectacle, and social media was buzzing with anticipation. It was becoming clear that the protest wasn't going to be a peaceful demonstration. It was shaping up to be a confrontation, a violent clash between two ideological sides. James was now at the heart of it all. His decision, whether to attend the rally or stay home, would determine whether he would further fuel the fire or take a step back from the chaos. The pressure was unbearable. He thought about it long and hard, weighing the consequences of his actions. Finally, he decided he would show up. He couldn't turn away from this now. He had become a symbol, whether he liked it or not. But more importantly, he had to prove something to himself. He wasn't just going to sit back and let his voice be drowned out. He had a right to speak, to stand, to be heard. The day of the protest, James put on the hat again. He walked out the door, determined, resolute. He was going to face whatever came his way, for better or worse. The atmosphere outside the mall was thick with tension. James stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as people from all sides gathered, supporters holding flags and signs, and protesters chanting slogans he didn't fully agree with. The air was charged, crackling with anticipation. This wasn't just a protest anymore. It was a battlefield, each side digging in deeper, convinced of their own righteousness. James had walked up alone. His phone buzzed with notifications, but he ignored it. No more media interviews. No more debates. For the first time in days, he felt free from the expectations placed on him. It was just him, his hat, and the decisions he would make here today. He was getting stares, whispers, and glares, but he kept his head high. He could feel the weight of the moment settling into his chest. Was he doing the right thing? Would he regret this? The rally wasn't just about him anymore. It had become a symbol of something much bigger. As he walked toward the center of the protest, James noticed a group of people who had been critical of him on social media. Some of them were now standing at the front, holding up their own signs condemning him and everything he stood for. A few of them turned to look at him, their eyes narrowing. There was a palpable energy in the air, the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. It felt like the beginning of a confrontation, something James knew deep down he had to face head on. A voice rose from the crowd, loud and demanding. "Hey, why don't you take that hat off, huh? You're not welcome here." James didn't flinch. He had expected this, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. The challenge had been thrown down. Now, it was his move. "Why should I?" James called back, his voice steady but loud enough to be heard. The group of protesters surged forward, their faces filled with anger. One of them, a tall man with a stern expression, stepped directly in front of him. "You're part of the reason this country's divided," he spat. "You're a disgrace." James stood his ground. The words didn't hurt anymore. He had heard worse. But what really stung now was the realization that no one had really tried to understand why he wore the hat in the first place. It wasn't about hate. It was about freedom, a symbol for a certain group of people that felt silenced. But they would never see it that way. The scene was escalating quickly. The shouting grew louder, with some people on both sides starting to push each other. James could feel the heat of the moment bearing down on him. A physical confrontation seemed imminent. The crowd was tense, ready to burst into chaos at any second. He had never been in a situation like this before. This wasn't a mall incident. It was now a full-blown, real-life demonstration of the polarized state of the nation. The anger, the emotions, the rhetoric, it all bled together into this one defining moment. But before things could go further, the sound of sirens cut through the noise. Police vehicles began pulling into the parking lot, their lights flashing. The authorities had been called in, probably to prevent the situation from escalating into violence. James didn't wait. He knew it was time to leave. This wasn't his fight anymore, not in the way he had imagined it. The rally had become less about individual expression and more about fueling division. It wasn't worth it. He turned around and began walking back toward the edge of the crowd, feeling the eyes of everyone upon him. His heart was pounding. His heart was pounding. He hadn't expected the protest to spiral out of control like this. But now, it was clear he wasn't just a symbol of free speech. He had become part of a much larger, much more dangerous narrative. As he made his way to the parking lot, the sounds of the protest faded behind him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had crossed a line, that the peaceful, civil conversation he had wanted was no longer possible. But what really gnawed at him was the question of what would happen next. This moment would be part of the public conversation for weeks, maybe longer. Was it worth it? He wasn't sure. James finally reached his car, the MAGA hat still firmly on his head. He stopped for a moment, looking at the reflection in the window. He didn't recognize the person staring back at him. It wasn't just the hat. It was the fact that he had become the face of something bigger, something out of his control. And now, he had to live with that. He got into his car and started the engine, pulling out of the parking lot. The rally behind him was already starting to dissolve, and the sirens faded into the distance. But James couldn't shake the weight of it all. He was now a part of a story much larger than himself, a story that was still unfolding and would continue to define him, whether he liked it or not. The world might never fully understand why he wore that hat, and in a way he was starting to doubt whether he even understood it himself. But one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, James' phone was already vibrating off his nightstand before sunrise. He groaned, reaching for it, only to squint at the notifications lighting up his screen. Hundreds of messages. His email inbox was packed. Social media? A disaster zone. He blinked, still groggy. Then he saw the headlines. Man in MAGA hat sparks mall controversy. Freedom of expression or provocation. James Miller, the face of division. James shot upright in bed, his heart pounding. News articles, blog posts, and videos. Someone must have uploaded footage of the rally, because his face, his stance, and his MAGA cap were suddenly plastered everywhere. Clips of him refusing to back down against angry protesters were now soundtracked with dramatic music and captions like, "Defiant or dangerous." He pulled up YouTube and grimaced when he saw himself in multiple trending videos. One had a thumbnail of his face zoomed in, overlaid with bold text. What really happened at the mall protest? He clicked it and regretted it immediately. The host, a smug young commentator, narrated, "This guy, James Miller, decided to stroll into a mall wearing a MAGA hat, and what happened next is exactly what you'd expect in today's America. Screaming, shoving, and absolute chaos. Some are calling him a hero for standing his ground. Others say he's just stirring the pot. But one thing's for sure, James Miller is now the face of the divide." The clip cut to footage of protesters chanting while James stood silent, his cap still on. The voiceover continued. Was he making a statement? Was he being stubborn? Either way, this man sparked a firestorm that's taking over social media. James flung his phone onto the bed, frustrated. He knew how it looked, but none of these people knew him. They didn't know he wasn't trying to pick a fight, that he didn't ask to become a viral symbol. And yet, there he was, being torn apart in the comment sections. MAGA guy gets what he deserves. Pure trash. I don't agree with his hat, but he has a right to wear it. Why does this stuff always have to turn violent? Legend for standing his ground. His eyes landed on the last notification. A text from an unknown number. You're gonna regret this. Watch your back. James' blood ran cold. He stared at the message, his mind racing. Was it just a troll? Or was someone serious? A knock on the bedroom door startled him. James. His mother's voice was soft. You need to come downstairs. You're on the news. James sighed, pulling on a hoodie. When he reached the living room, his parents were watching a cable news broadcast. A photo of James in the mall was displayed on screen, the anchor's voice serious. What started as a peaceful rally turned chaotic when a man wearing a MAGA cap refused to leave the premises. Witnesses claimed his presence was provocative and escalated tensions, though others argue he was simply exercising his First Amendment rights. This incident has ignited a national debate about free speech, public spaces, and political expression. The screen switched to an interview with a woman holding a protest sign. That hat represents hate, the woman said angrily. He came looking for trouble, and he got it. James' father clicked the TV off, muttering, "This is a circus." His mother turned to him, her face full of concern. "James, this is getting out of control. You're all over the news. People are talking about you everywhere." James dropped onto the couch, his face in his hands. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't do anything." His father's voice was firm but calm. "The problem is, son, you're not just James Miller anymore. You're a story now, and stories have a way of spiraling out of control." As the media storm raged on, James began to realize just how far-reaching the fallout of the mall incident had become. At first, he tried to ignore the news and the notifications, but it was impossible. The story followed him everywhere. It wasn't just on TV. It was in his neighborhood, his school, and even among his closest friends. The morning after the news aired, James' phone buzzed with a message from his best friend, Rob. "Dude, what the hell? You're on every channel. Call me." James sighed, reluctantly dialing. "Hey, man," Rob started, his voice a mix of shock and amusement. "What were you thinking wearing that hat to a rally? You had to know it was gonna blow up." "I wasn't thinking anything," James replied defensively. "I just wore the hat. That's it." "Well, now half the country knows your name. People at school are already talking about it. Some think you're a legend. Others say you're a jerk for causing trouble." James rubbed his temples. "Causing trouble? I didn't do anything." "Yeah, well, perception's everything," Rob said bluntly. "Look, I've got your back, but not everyone will. I'm just giving you a heads up." By the time James walked into school that day, Rob's warning proved accurate. As he made his way through the halls, students stared, whispered, and shot him looks. Some supportive, others hostile. "Hey, MAGA man," someone called sarcastically from across the hall, followed by laughter. A few kids clapped him on the back. "Respect, bro. Takes guts to stand up like that." Others weren't so kind. James overheard a girl mutter, "People like him are what's wrong with this country." He kept his head down, ignoring it as best he could. But during lunch, things came to a head. James was sitting with Rob and a few others when Ashley, a girl from his English class, marched up to their table, her face red with anger. "You're seriously proud of yourself," she demanded. "Wearing that hat in public, stirring people up." "Stirring people up?" James looked up, his jaw tightening. "I didn't stir anyone up. I just wore a hat." "That hat represents hate," Ashley shot back. "You knew exactly what you were doing." Rob jumped in. "Chill, Ashley. He's got a right to wear what he wants." "A right? Sure," she snapped. "But actions have consequences. He wanted attention, and now he's got it." James stood up. "Jeez, void attention. I didn't want attention. I didn't ask for this. You don't—" Ashley scoffed. "Everyone knows enough." She turned and stormed off, leaving the table awkwardly silent. Rob leaned in, trying to lighten the mood. "She's just mad you're famous now." James shook his head, pushing his tray away. "I didn't ask to be famous. The tension at school was bad enough, but it didn't stop there." That night, James' father found him sitting on the porch, staring at his phone. "Everything okay?" his dad asked, sitting beside him. James sighed. "No. People at school are acting like I'm some villain or hero. I didn't ask for any of this. And now," he held up his phone, "I'm getting hate messages. Some of these are—" He stopped, his voice catching. "Some of them are threats, Dad." His father frowned, taking the phone to read the messages. "You're gonna pay for this, MAGA scum. Watch your back. You're not safe. This is getting out of hand." His father muttered, "We need to take this seriously. What do I do?" "What do I do?" James asked, his voice full of frustration. "I can't just hide in the house forever. I didn't do anything wrong." "You didn't," his dad agreed, his expression hardening. "But the world doesn't always play fair. You have to decide how you're going to handle this. Stand tall, or let them break you. It's your choice." James looked out at the darkening sky, his mind swirling. He wasn't sure how much more he could take, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let anyone tell him who he was. The next day, James woke up to an unexpected email. It was from someone named Laura Mendez, a reporter for a conservative news outlet. The subject line read, "Your story matters. Let's talk." James frowned, unsure what to make of it. He clicked on the message. "Hi, James. I've been following the situation at your local mall, and I'd love to give you a chance to tell your side of the story. Many people feel like voices like yours are being drowned out. Would you be open to an interview? Sincerely, Laura Mendez, senior correspondent." James reread it twice before showing it to his dad over breakfast. "What do you think?" James asked cautiously. His dad leaned back, chewing his toast thoughtfully. His dad leaned back, chewing his toast thoughtfully. It's risky, but this might be an opportunity. The media's been twisting things so far. Maybe this is a chance to set the record straight. Yeah, but what if they twist this too? James replied, doubt lacing his voice. James replied, doubt lacing his voice. I don't know if I want more attention. His mom chimed in gently. James, sometimes the best way to fight back is to speak up. You have a story to tell, and you don't have to let other people define it for you. After a long moment, James sighed and nodded. Okay, I'll do it. 2 days later, James found himself sitting in his living room, a camera crew setting up as Laura Mendez sat across from him, professional and composed. She greeted him warmly, assuring him that her goal was to let him share his experience honestly. The interview began. So, James, Laura started, let's go back to that day at the mall. Can you walk us through what happened? James took a deep breath, steadying himself. I went to the mall to shop for sneakers. I wore my MAGA hat because, well, I like it. I didn't think it was a big deal. But the minute I walked in, I noticed people staring. Some looked upset, others just confused. I ignored it and went about my day. Laura nodded, listening intently. And what happened when the mall staff approached you? I was in the store when a security guard came up and told me I had to leave because of my hat. I thought he was joking at first, but then he got serious. He said my hat was offensive and disturbing the peace. And how did you respond? James frowned slightly, his voice firm. I asked him how a hat could disturb the peace. I wasn't yelling, I wasn't causing trouble. I was just shopping. He didn't care. He told me I had to leave, so I walked out. Laura leaned in. So I walked out. Laura leaned in. How did that make you feel? Honestly? James hesitated, then looked straight into the camera. It made me feel like I didn't belong. Like wearing a hat that says "Make America Great Again" means I'm automatically a bad person. But that's not true. I'm not a bad person. I'm not trying to offend anyone. I just wore a hat. Laura's expression softened. And since that day, what's life been like for you? James sighed. It's been tough. People at school have been weird. Some are supportive, but others act like I'm toxic. I've gotten messages online, some of them really nasty. I've even gotten threats, all because of a hat. Laura looked into the camera as she wrapped up the interview. James' story is a powerful reminder of the divide in our country right now. A hat, a teenager, and an incident that sparked a nationwide debate. At the heart of it all is a question: when do we stop listening to each other? And can we find a way back? The interview ended, and the crew packed up. Laura shook James' hand. You did great, she said. You did great, she said. This is going to help people see you for who you really are. James hoped she was right. The interview aired that weekend, and the response was overwhelming. Unlike the first viral video that painted him as a villain, this time people saw James' side of the story. Social media blew up. The kid did nothing wrong. He's got guts for standing up. When did we decide a hat could make someone a target? Whether you like the hat or not, freedom means being able to wear it. Of course, not everyone agreed. Some critics still called him a troublemaker, but the tide was shifting. James' inbox filled with messages of support. People thanking him for standing tall, sharing their own stories of being judged for their beliefs. And then came the most surprising message of all. It was an email from an attorney. Hi James, I'm reaching out because I believe your rights were violated at the mall. My firm specializes in cases like yours, and I think we have grounds for a legal case. If you're interested, let's talk. James stared at the email, his heart racing. He hadn't thought about legal action, but now that the idea was in front of him, he couldn't ignore it. James sat at the kitchen table, staring at the email from the attorney. He reread it multiple times before finally bringing it up to his parents that evening. His dad looked up from his laptop, intrigued. You're serious about this? His dad asked, a little surprised. I don't know, James admitted. I don't know, James admitted. I didn't think about suing anyone. But if they really violated my rights, shouldn't I do something about it? What if this happens to someone else? His mom chimed in gently. It's a big decision, James. Going through with a lawsuit isn't easy. It'll take time and energy, and the attention might get worse before it gets better. But it's not about the attention, Mom, James replied firmly. It's about standing up for myself. His dad leaned back, studying James thoughtfully. Well, son, you're 17 now, old enough to make this choice. If you want to move forward, we'll support you. With his parents' blessing, James replied to the attorney's email. Within 24 hours, he was on a video call with Sarah Richards, a sharp, no-nonsense civil rights lawyer who had a track record of winning similar cases. James, Sarah said, her tone professional but kind. What happened to you at that mall isn't just unfair. It's unconstitutional. They kicked you out for expressing yourself, and that's a violation of your First Amendment rights. We can hold them accountable. James nodded, listening intently as Sarah explained the process. The mall's management would be notified of the lawsuit, and they'd either settle quietly or fight back in court. Either way, James' story would continue to spread. I'll be honest with you, Sarah added. This will get attention. People will have opinions, good and bad. But I'll be with you every step of the way. James looked into the camera, determination shining in his eyes. I want to do this. I'm tired of people getting away with stuff like this. A week later, the lawsuit made headlines. Teen files lawsuit after being kicked out of mall for MAGA hat. News outlets picked up the story immediately. Conservative commentators hailed James as a hero, a young man standing up for free speech in the face of political bias. Liberal outlets were split. Some called it an overreaction, while others cautiously acknowledged James' rights had been violated. James's phone buzzed nonstop. Friends, family, and even strangers reached out with words of encouragement. You're doing the right thing, man. Keep fighting. Don't let them silence you. My kid had the same thing happen at school. Thank you for standing up. But along with the support came more backlash. On social media, critics mocked him relentlessly. Crying over a hat? Grow up. He's just doing this for attention. Typical. Playing the victim card. James learned to ignore the noise. He focused on the bigger picture. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who felt like their voice didn't matter. The lawsuit moved forward quickly. Sarah Richards and her team gathered evidence, including video footage of James being escorted out of the mall, witness statements, and documents showing the mall's policies on disturbing attire. In preparation for the hearing, Sarah sat James down for a mock interview. James, the other side will try to paint you as a troublemaker, she warned. They'll say you wore that hat to provoke people. James frowned. That's not true. No, I wore it because I like what it stands for. Exactly, Sarah said, nodding. You need to stay calm and clear. Focus on the facts, not emotions. Got it, got it. The hearing day arrived, and James felt like he was walking into a storm. Cameras lined the courthouse steps, reporters shouting questions as he and his parents made their way inside. James, are you ready for this? His dad whispered as they waited for the proceedings to begin. James glanced at the crowd, then back at his dad. Yeah, I'm ready. Inside the courtroom, the mall's attorneys argued that the hat had caused tension and disrupted the shopping experience. They insisted their actions were justified, but Sarah was ready. She stood up confidently and addressed the court. What my client wore that day, a simple red hat, was an expression of his beliefs. It was peaceful. It was quiet, and yet he was treated like a criminal. This is not about a hat. This is about freedom of speech and the right to express oneself without fear of persecution. She played the security footage for the judge, showing James calmly leaving the mall, surrounded by guards. She called witnesses who confirmed James had done nothing to incite conflict. When James took the stand, he spoke clearly and calmly, just as Sarah had coached him. I didn't go to the mall to cause trouble, he said. I just wanted to shop. I wore my hat because it represents what I believe in, and that's my right as an American. The courtroom fell silent. For the first time, James felt truly heard. Days turned into weeks as the judge reviewed the arguments and evidence presented. The waiting was the hardest part for James. Each morning he checked his phone, hoping for a notification from Sarah, but nothing came. In the meantime, Life moved forward. James kept going to school, where classmates had mixed reactions. Some treated him like a celebrity, praising his courage. Others avoided him, whispering behind his back. "You are the guy who sued the mall, right?" one kid said in the hallway. "Yeah," James replied, keeping it short. "That's pretty cool." James shrugged, hiding a small smile. Deep down, though, he felt a growing sense of pride. Win or lose, he had stood up for himself, and that mattered. Finally, on a crisp Friday morning, Sarah called. "James," she said, her voice steady but excited. The judge issued his decision. "We won." James' heart leaped. Wait, what? What? "We won. Yep. The court ruled that the mall violated your First Amendment rights. They're being held accountable." James's parents, who were sitting nearby, jumped up when they heard the news. "What does this mean exactly?" his mom asked as Sarah continued. It means the mall has to issue a formal apology to James and revise its policies to prevent this from happening again. They're also paying a settlement. Enough to cover our legal fees and a little extra for James' trouble." James was stunned. He'd hoped for justice, but he hadn't expected the victory to feel this good. "Thank you, Sarah," James said quietly. "For everything. You did this, James," she replied. "You stood up and you won. Be proud of yourself." The story exploded across the media. Teen wins free speech lawsuit after being kicked out for MAGA hat. Conservative commentators celebrated the ruling as a victory for free speech. James was invited to appear on popular news programs, where hosts praised his bravery. "James, you're an inspiration," one anchor said. "What message do you have for young Americans who might face similar situations?" James spoke confidently. "Stand up for yourself. If you know you're in the right, don't let anyone silence you. We have rights in this country, and we need to protect them." His words resonated far and wide. Social media flooded with support. Strangers messaged James, thanking him for being a voice for free expression. "I wore my hat today because of you. You give me hope for the future, kid." Even some of James' critics began to soften. A few admitted they didn't agree with the hat, but they respected his courage to stand up for his beliefs. The mall, under pressure from the public and the court's ruling, issued an official apology. "We acknowledge that our actions were inappropriate and violated Mr. Thompson's rights. We are taking steps to ensure this does not happen again." For James, seeing those words in print was the final validation. He hadn't just won a lawsuit. He'd made a real change. Section 16. Moving forward, life eventually settled back into normalcy. James returned to the mall for the first time since the incident, his MAGA hat proudly perched on his head. This time, no one stopped him. Some shoppers gave him nods of approval, while others looked away, but no one dared kick him out. "Feels good, huh?" his dad said as they walked through the mall together. James grinned. "Yeah, it does." Over the months that followed, James' story continued to inspire others. He was invited to speak at local events about free speech and standing up for one's beliefs. His confidence grew with each appearance, and he discovered a new passion for public speaking. "I never thought a stupid hat could change my life," James joked during one speech, earning laughs from the crowd. "But it's not about the hat. It's about having the courage to stand up for yourself when it counts." His story became a symbol for free expression, proving that one person, no matter how young, can make a difference. Years later, James reflected on the events that had shaped his life. He was now in college, studying political science and law, driven by a desire to protect the rights of others. Whenever he faced a challenge, he remembered the 17-year-old kid who refused to back down, no matter how tough things got, and that kid still wore his MAGA hat proudly.